Thank you for having me. Designing Homophily, I try to make an argument that the production of imagery, of utopia, of artistic production and visualizations of architecture have played a role in both North and South Korean development, and how certain questions that we have in the project after 8 years, going to the next phase and wanting to work on enclaves or encapsulations in South Korea's urbanism, might have been influenced along this kind of architectural and artistic production. When the topic of the conference came up, I felt a bit embarrassed because I realized, after having worked with Martina and our teams for 8 years on first smart cities in South Korea, Songdo Smart City, and then on LGBTQ spatial production in Seoul, and that actually we have never really talked about design, and I'm an architect. We have talked about co-production of spaces, spatializing of everyday activities. We have talked about desires in terms of housing markets, accessibility to the city, and we have talked to architect friends, but more on parties and getting drunk, but not really discussing how their artistic and architectural production is linked to what we look at. So I entered Korea for 8 years like a social scientist, being a little bit embarrassed that I'm a designer and hardly ever talking about design. So what I did, I was, for this input, going through the visual resources, some kind of private interests that I had and personal connections, and try to produce something like a visual essay that might inform our work in the hopefully third phase. The abstract that we also have in the book, and more or less the lecture still relates to it, makes an argument that both in North and South Korea, urbanization and the very rapid modernization was linked to visual production of an imagery of utopia, of a near future, of hope, and that this major shift that we have now come to see from, at least as it turns out in South Korea, from a very collective society as a whole, construction and idea of the country, towards a more and more fragmentalized idea of flocking together, of building enclaves, communities, both as safer spaces, but also as enclaves, as we know, for the middle classes. And this story I want to tell alongside this visual production. In 2014, so long before this project started, I visited my friends Min-Suk Cho's Korean pavilion at the Venice Biennial. This is the book that they produced alongside Crows-Eyed View, the Korean Peninsula. His idea about the exhibition was to give space for both North and South Korean architects, which had never happened in history. Like, this image is a 1980s architects convention, where the last time North and South Korean architects came together, and at the end of this convention, also Korean Japanese architects, they all got up, and one architect initiated a common singing of a popular folk song, and after the conference was then interrogated by the authorities of South Korea, like how this could have happened. There's certain disciplining, but in this spirit of this last 1980s convention, Min-Suk Cho wanted to construct the pavilion with Northern and Southern architect production. It did not work. He failed through all official instances to reach North Korean architects. And he had then to kind of reformulate the concept of not showing contemporary, at this time, North Korean architectural production, but he had access to a lot of visual material from the history of North Korea's urban development. He had access to a kind of artist group, architects group in North Korea, state collective. through a friend. Plus, he was then kind of orchestrating the exhibition in a way that also the South Korean part was talking more about the historical kind of development, the modernization, and the kind of visual production. So this this revisiting of this exhibition also led me to the question, like, what kind of utopian, in a very loose use of this word, imageries have had as an impact to the current production and state of architecture and urbanism. This was the North Korean room where you see both production of propaganda material, you see work of this architecture artist collective Monsanday Studio, which comprises 4,000 state-employed artists and architects for visual production in North Korea, plus commissions also that he gave out, like his friend who's running the only tourist company bringing tourists to North Korea, and thus having made the context for utopian future architectural work from this kind of North Korean architect's perspective. If you look historically from the propaganda material that you get from the 50s onwards, the role of the worker in constructing this new housing, of kind of contributing to the mass housing program of the North Korean government is celebrated. You see like everyday street scenes of the urbanization that followed. And through artistic production, for example, by Seung Won Bak, there's a series of photographs which are enlargements of haphazardly taking photographs while on visit in North Korea, show the actual realization of the urbanization of the North Korean part of the peninsula. And similar processes were happening under a totally different government, not both state-led, but this is a private development in the South Korea, also documented late 70s by Jun Min Cho. I don't go too deeply into the history and the political histories of both countries, but one can say that after the Korean War in '53, both countries started to establish, with also the help of their allies, a state building program that led to what one could call a compressed modernization of the country, like in the time span of maybe 20, 30 years. This both societies changed from mainly rural coined societies, and definitely even stronger the South Korean part, to really industrialized, urbanized, modern societies. In South Korea, this is coined as the miracle on the Han River, this kind of state activity in urbanization, and it both started in the time of authoritarian regime until '87, and was then even accelerated after '87 with the opening also to a more democratic form of government, and has led on the South Korean part to what we call apatu urbanism or apartment urbanism, like for the kind of more affluent now middle class, the ideal of owning an apartment in one of these mass house settlements with a specific, very South Korean economic background, because you have half an ownership and half a rent system within the individual apartment that you buy. But what is interesting is that not so in a different way of, let's say, organization and financing, also the North Korean urbanization was taking part. So it's a little bit, the documentation is kind of bad, but you see that these structures proclaim like similar ideals. And when you look at the artist production started from onwards the late 80s and 90s, a lot of these ways of how do we live, how do we work, how is our everyday life constituted, in South Korea very much thematizes this. This is a series by Jung Jin-do, and on Evergreen Tower, one kind of pretty ordinary, regular housing project of South Korean apato-urbanism. And you see how the standardized, like even taking the photographs, the standardized living room in this 22 high-rise, and the individual families, middle-class families with 2 or 3 kids represented. At this time, like in the 90s, you find production, for example, by international Korean artists like Do Soo, who thematized the idea of domesticity in their work, of what constitutes a home, how home is related, and he does it internationally because he's based in both London and New York, but always refers back to questions of society, construction of society, individualism, and society as a whole. The left work is from a long series of this reconstruction, one-to-one reconstruction of the domestic spaces, whereas the second is an installation on the dismantling of Robin Hood Gardens, like a very renowned British housing project that was lately dismantled. But what is interesting in his way of working is that he always has a second strain of artworks that really think or rethink the collective, like here Floor, which consists of an endless mass of little figurines that hold up this glass on floor, but he always documents them, you know, as being walked on. And when you try to read on the interpretation of art critics, he leaves it very ambivalent if this is a commentary on North Korean kind of mass society or on South Korea as a society. And I find this really interesting that he does so. And at the time, like from the 90s onwards, when artists go discussing the questions of the collective, also the question of the individual comes up. And it's interesting when you look at Confucianism, that Confucianism as we think has been very proliferant in all the kind of mass societies of you know, the Eastern Hemisphere, but it puts a lot of pressure on the individual. It's very much about the responsibility of the individual within society, and you see in the work of Kim Soja, where she photographs herself in different cities, always in public space, always being nearly run over, but in the same position. And she also lets it very ambiguous if this kind of representation, these are stills from videos, if this is constituting herself as an individual within a mass, or whether she's disappearing, like she's describing both the appearance and the disappearance of the individual. And if we go back to Do Soo, he started a series of wallpapers where like minuscule small portraits would create this pattern of nearly undisguisable individual characters. And what I thought was mind-provoking, that after having made a lot of installations with this physical wallpaper, in 2013 he had a project for Samsung, one of the big kind of industrial companies, enterprises, for taking a portrait or uploading a portrait of each one of the employees. But this was then an interactive installation, and there was the possibility, if you log in with your phone and you identify yourself as the person that is portrayed, you become enlarged and you fill the screen for the moment of your presence in this kind of art installation. So this kind of blending in, coming out is a topic. And we think, alongside what we realize, that conflicts in contemporary South Korean societies, that this standing up for individual rights of certain minorities, of certain individual kind of claim of lifestyles, and the conflict with the mass society is what kind of drives refiguration currently also in the urban area. Going back to the production of this North Korean artist collective, state collective, you see a lot of these depiction of ideal urban scenery. In literature, when stuff is described, there should be a mountain in the background. Here there's no mountain. There should be water in the foreground. There should be the kind of natural, pristine park-like nature, plus then high-rise buildings. And I just found this, I think, a couple of weeks ago, whereas This is Songdo Smart City that we had worked on for 4 years, this kind of prototypical urbanization of a smart city. But the preparation of society for this kind of smartification of the everyday and these model projects did not come from nowhere. You find, for example, comics like this by Samsung, which is an educational management brochure in the form of a comic book that should talk and deliver the next societal and economic change that is coming about. It was brought out in '93. I have made a little translation, but you see here there is a new city envisioned, water in front, the trees in the back, a couple that's sitting there saying this looks like Paris, the Seine in Paris. They talk about testbed factories, new production, and they talk about leisure and sports. The managers have an extreme discussion if this implementation of modern electronics in building would kind of work, but they're convinced that suddenly, apartments have embedded digital infrastructure. For example, in a pissoir or a toilet, so you could be directly diagnosed with parasites, or you could kind of identify the level of blood sugar. And what comes out of this conversation in this comic book, that there's a new term that is coined, and when you translate it, it sounds a little bit awkward, but I find it funny, the electronics construction heavy industry. So the combination of the building industry and the electronic industry. And for example, Samsung, which we know as a producer of electronics, but has been since the late 50s one of also the major construction companies. So there are Samsung developments of this kind of Apato urbanization. And I think I have a last kind of little slide where you can see that definitely also the densification, the turn to high rises, and even the thinking further into, probably even military production was advertised. The book is it's not that thin, like it quite tells a whole story, but was directed really to the management boards, but also to the more general public. So what did we see when we came to Songdo? And we thought we come and we see the very latest implementation of building embedded technology. But what we found, a major shift had happened, and a lot of the technology was already used with smartphones, mobile phones, and the systems were a little bit more complex. But what we found was an interesting phenomena of these individual developments on Songdo Smart City, which we described as semi-gated because they were accessible by everyone, but just controlled, like each of these development by, for example, here with First World, 400 CCTVs, as much as also the exterior space was controlled by CCTVs to the central control room. And it was the practice of everyday life that you felt that people knew exactly that this city was surveilled. What interested us more was the idea of how do I constitute my everyday life within a city like that as such, and what are the services and what is the psychology that develops within these, within living in such a smart city with this perfect life being catered to middle class. And one thing we found out is that the idea of owning an apartment extended itself in contrast to the other apartment developments that we looked at, because so many points within the city in the exterior space were accessible via data communication, visual cameras, CCTVs that you could even access through your own apartment, that we got the idea that the propriety extended beyond the apartment to this community, to the city itself, and to the whole island of Songdo Smart City as an enclave, that you have a certain kind of idea of ownership. So what is constructed or reproduced through a development like this is both the homogeneity of the middle class that inhabits it, but also the homophily from an individual level of how you kind of access and communicate and live your everyday life. This is a very small image. So, how you access this smart city is both through Incheon, from Seoul, or from the airport through this bridge. And in Minchuk So's exhibition, there was an image I remembered from Moon Hoon. Moon Hoon is actually an architect. He does kind of luxurious, high-end apartments and single family house villas, you can say, pavilions, like it's very pristine architectural practice. But what he's as known for is also his drawings. And this, for example, is called Prizone. When he describes it, it's a mixture of prison and rhizome. You see this supposedly housing tower, but which expands like a rhizome over the island, over the coast, near to this bridge. I thought maybe, and I have not investigated on that, it's a commentary on Songdo Smart City, maybe, and also this idea of being contained, being kind of organic but technological, but also expanding within, you know, this kind of island area would be interesting to look at. His production is pretty wild, and there's a lot going on in his just drawing work. Even his website features more his drawings than actually his architecture. But I also found images like this, Ring Ring, which is again thinking about, you know, a lot of them is imaginary architecture, utopian vision. But here I cannot help, without having further investigated, to think of a more kind of diverse, queer, fairy background, you know, happy 1970s inspired alternative housing. It's also kind of composed out of these bubbles or enclaves, but you see the people standing outside. This kind of happy vision from 2011 would be interesting to investigate what he means, because what we did for the last 4 years, really looking at LGBTQ and queer space production in Korea, and this is very, very, very contested. I just show you 2 examples. This is, for example, the Seoul Queer Parade that Sung-un, our team member, visited and took part in 2022, which had been always held a couple of years before on the main plaza in front of the town hall, but in this year faced so much demonstrations of fundamental kind of Christian and anti-LGBTQ groups that they had to kind of fence them off in the last minute with a controlled entrance, and also fend off the protesters. This fence, this semi-transparent fence that was erected, did not really help to the full, because the demonstrants from the outside had arranged like for a couple of really big loudspeakers that then would, per sound, infiltrate and penetrate this border and make most of the conversation and the music gigs in the festival impossible. This as a kind of top-down measure to create a safe space, to create an encapsulation, but a strategy which is more prevalent in everyday, like gay, lesbian, queer life, is that there are several measures of discretion that are built up both online with profiles of individuals, but also profiles of bars, specific codes to enter, and as much in the physical real bars. This is what we count the gay building, but it's just a representation for a couple of buildings in Jongno where, you know, queer people go out. But what is very typical is that the queer spaces, the queer bars on the first, second, third floor. On the ground floor, you find a regular cafe. The signature is very much hidden and discreet. And in this example that we found, there's even people sitting in the regular bar, cafe, kind of controlling the entrance area, who is walking to the elevator to also secure people from being kind of attacked, or it's also a prevalent kind of feeling of insecurity that happens around these spaces. for us, we thought that this shift, this change from a society that still discusses itself as a collective, a broader level, but where we see much more differentiation in lifestyle, where we see differentiation in expectations to the future. I did not talk too much about the two big economic crises that were happening, so the insecurity of the middle class themselves, of the insecurity when it comes to also establishing families. As we all know, like South Korea is the country with the lowest birth rate worldwide, because people are not really believing in this establishing of a family as a concept and as an economically sustainable way of living. But also the idea that these neighborhoods that are catered to specific parts of the society are more or less constructed like these kind of encapsulated situations. Plus, we were looking at other phenomena, like how even the rural revitalization is currently supported by the government through artist communities, artist tourism to specific parts of the town. And what we're interested in the next phase is to look at especially these encapsulations and their permeability and their communication to the surroundings, the background, or the environment. This one thing is these child-free zones. This is a short current map on all the kind of cafes, restaurants that are coined as being preferably child-free. Also the discussion on the internet, like how people try to still enter a bar that they met when they were dating, but were not allowed back in when they come with their newborn, and all the kind of discourse around this. So this is one part we are focusing on, and the next one is about a luxurious development by MIH architects in the center of the city, Cheongdam Tower, but also just by revisiting all this, for example, work of architects and artists on this kind of utopian mixture of, organicism, greenness. I think there's something to it that also this architect maybe involuntarily has produced that could have been read by people in the cultural production. So this could be something interesting to look about, to talk about. We are more interested also to understand how the development is both organized, planned, communicated, and then also marketed and sold. So we're visiting the process of this encapsulation. And the third part that we want to look at is the Jeju Island as an island for this kind of state-supported artist community and art tourism that changed a lot, where there are also conflicts with the kind of nearby villages and inhabitants. And here I did not want to overdo it, but when, for example, I looked at some of the projects as touristic projects on Jeju Island, they refer back a lot to the visual production of, let's say, this kind of North Korean architect collective, where I have no idea where this comes from. So, yeah, this is a little bit like the range that we want to look at. This is the first attempt to look back at art and architecture production when we look at the problem of encapsulations, to maybe shift the perspective, and also maybe from kind of my personal interest to go more back with the kind of into a discussion with architects, artists on site, and integrating this. Then my last slide has really nothing to do with this presentation. Nothing. But when I was putting it together on the weekend, I was sitting with a colleague of mine, and I was talking about what I'm doing, and he said he cannot understand. For him, it's totally impossible that we even think about this topic of the individual versus the collective, current cultural production and media, without having ever gone or not even planning to go into K-pop. So I think this is something we have to also discuss with our team. I'm not familiar, I'm maybe too old, but I think we have one team member who's perfect in karaoke. K-pop karaoke, and maybe we go a little bit that direction. Thank you very much for this short presentation.